Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 7th in a series of 8 webinars organized by Ecologic Institute under the POLIMP project, a project financed by the European Commission's DG Research and organized together with 7 partners from around the Union, led by Joint Implementation Network in the Netherlands. Our topic today is effort sharing, how to divide up the EU's greenhouse gas target amid the 28 member states, the intricacies, the mechanisms involved, flexibilities, etc. And to discuss this topic with me, I have the pleasure of having 2 experts here to talk to us about it. One, Femke de Jong, who is EU Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch based in Brussels. Welcome, Femke.
Welcome, thank you.
And Dr. Nils Meyer-Ohlendorf, who is Head of Global Policies at Ecologic Institute and a dear colleague of mine. Thanks for joining us, Nils.
Thank you, Matthias.
So the topic, effort sharing, is a little bit tricky. It's a term that's not standard in an English language dictionary, and is rather a technical process that is at the heart, though, at the way in which the EU organizes the EU climate policy. So we thought it useful to basically be starting off with a little bit of background and explain how that mechanism works and what is involved. And Femke, you've kindly agreed to take us through those initial steps. You have the floor. Give us a little bit of background.
Yes, hello. So I guess indeed there are not very many people who know what is the effort sharing decision. We have therefore prepared a little bit of presentation. I don't know if everyone can see it. So if you look at what are the current elements of the 2020 climate package, on the one hand we have the carbon market, the EU's emissions trading system, covering a lot of installations from the power and industry sectors and also aircraft operators. But this tackles only around 40% of EU's greenhouse gas emissions. So we also have another policy instrument called the effort sharing decision. This is EU legislation that sets emission reduction targets for those sectors that are not covered by the EU ETS, and this includes, for example, the transport, building and agriculture sector. And then we have the emissions and removals from land use and forestry, but at the moment these are currently not included in our 2020 climate objective. So for the 2020 climate framework, we have an overall target of 20% greenhouse gas reductions by 2020 compared to 1990 level. And this target is split into separate targets for the EU ETS and the effort sharing decision. So for the effort sharing decision, the target is set as a 10% CO2 emission reduction by 2020 compared to 2005 level. And this overall 10% reduction effort is then sort of shared between the countries. So this is where also the name effort sharing comes from. And these national targets for each member state are based on the economic capacity of the different member states. So the gross domestic product per capita. So the most wealthiest member states has a target of 20% CO2 reductions by 2020, while the poorest member state, Bulgaria, can increase its emissions by 20%. Currently, as said before, there are the several sectors that are covered by the ESD. The biggest one is the transport sector, but also the agriculture and building sector plays a big role. And other than that, we have some smaller sectors, including waste, energy industries, and industrial processes. Now looking forward post-2020, which is what the current political debate is about, is how to design the effort sharing decision after 2020. And compared to the current framework, some things have changed. The most important one is that the emissions and removals from land use and forestry will be included in our 2030 climate objective. And one of the open questions is how this will be done. And it can be done, for example, by putting it in the effort sharing decision, or it can be a separate climate instrument, or it can be put together with agriculture. And then another thing that might be different is that there is talk of maybe having a link between the ETS and the effort sharing decision. So the 20 2030 climate target is an at least 40% domestic target compared to 1990 levels. If we go to the next slide. And this is again divided into a target for the ETS and a target for the non-ETS sectors. So for the non-ETS sectors, the target is set at a 30% reduction compared to 2005 levels. And this 30% overall target is again divided into different national targets. And this is sort of the debate among member states and the Commission at the moment, is how to share this 30% reduction target between the different member states. The EU leaders have already decided that for the lower income member states, it will be done by economic capacity again, so GDP per capita. But for the richer member states, they will also take into account the cost-effective potential of those member states. But how this will be done is still an area of discussion. And every target will be between a 0% target, so stabilizing 2005 emission levels, up to a 40% emission reductions. I guess a final word on the effort sharing decision is how it is designed. So what the ESD basically does is it sets out annual carbon budgets expressed in so-called annual emission allocations. So each country has an annual budget of how much CO2 it can emit, and this budget declines each year. And 1 AEA equals 1 ton of CO2 emissions. So overall for the EU, it is a bit unclear yet how the carbon budget would look like exactly, but in 2030 at least, the emissions cannot be higher than 2,040 million megatons of CO2 equivalents, or this is equal to 2,040 million AAAs in this year. Excellent. I hope this clarifies a few things.
Thank you very much, Femke. That was a super concise and yet comprehensive overview and explanation of the mechanism, if I've ever seen one. I really appreciate that, and I think you've already, of course, while charting what the system looks like right now, pointed us to a few things that are at the heart of what the debate at the EU level will be about in the next 2 years. But maybe, Nils, you could give us a more sort of conclusive rundown of what you see the key issues are that need to be decided in this process.
Thank you, Matthias. I think the key issues, in terms of 2030, one is flexibility. To what extent will we see flexibility similar to what we have now? This is, of course, one of those words. If you are working on EU climate policies, flexibility is probably one of your favorite words. So just to explain what I mean by flexibility, the current framework allows member states to reach their target in different ways. They can deviate from their annual reduction target to some extent, and that is what is called flexibility. In addition, member states can transfer AEAs from one member state to the other. There's another possibility of flexibility. But now the European Council in October 2014 decided to enhance flexibility further. To use the wording of the European Council, it wants to enhance flexibility significantly. So that leads us to the question, what additional flexibilities could we see in 2030? And one is, and what Femke already mentioned, is a one-off ETS intervention in the ESD. That means that member states could use a certain amount of ETS allowances for the purpose of meeting their ESD target. That is one additional flexibility that we will see, most likely we'll see in the next decade. The other one is that member states can use or can auction AEAs. That would be another possibility. And the last one is project mechanisms. So that is one issue, flexibility. How can we enhance this? But we should understand that the current regime already is quite flexible. So whenever we talk about additional flexibility, we need to understand that this should not hinder or jeopardize compliance. So this is one. The other one, I guess, should have started with this one, because actually the more important question is target setting. Femke already mentioned that we will have a system that allocates national targets So we have the overall reduction requirement of a target of 30%, but that will be divided among member states. And as you know, this is not an easy exercise. The setting of national targets is something that most member states are very interested in, to put it mildly. But the European Council decided that we will have a range of possible national targets ranging from 0, stabilizing, to minus 40%. How this will be done, there are some criteria, and I think it will be very similar to what we have seen in the run-up to 2020. But it is an interesting question, and it's one of the key questions, of course, how to set the targets for member states in the next commitment period. Another issue that might be interesting, I mean, to some extent, is compliance. I mean, what kind of compliance system will we have after 2020? And the last one is maybe I should stop here at this point. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nils, for that overview, and especially for giving our viewers a little bit of an overview of the different means by which member states can facilitate their compliance with the targets through flexibility. But Femke, maybe you have additional items, issues that you'd like to point out? And maybe if you want to, can you tell us where you see the greatest opportunities from your perspective to enhance the mechanism, but where also you see threats?
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think at least one of the things that we think is very useful in the post-2020 framework is that one of the flexibilities that we think didn't help the current regime is the use of international carbon offsets. So at the moment, countries can use a lot of international carbon offsets to meet their climate targets, so they can buy from projects in developing countries. And we have seen certain problems associated with these carbon offsets. Sometimes these projects were not additional, sometimes they have led to human rights abuses, etc. So for the post-2020 framework, now EU leaders have said, we don't want these international offsets anymore. So this is one flexibility that will not come back after 2020, and we think this is a great opportunity to focus also on domestic emission abatement. And I think one of the greatest opportunities for the effort sharing decision is that it, in a way, what was mentioned by Nils before is indeed the current discussion is about target setting versus flexibilities. And for a lot of member states, there is sort of a link between the two. So if they see they get a very, or in their eyes, quite stringent target, they also want to have the tools, the flexibilities in order to meet that target. And while we think flexibilities can be useful and are maybe needed to a certain extent, we also think that there are a lot of benefits associated with reducing emissions in the transport, building, and agriculture sector that shouldn't be forgotten. In a way, what we like the ESD to be is sort of a driver for sectoral policies, for example, that make sure that the fuel efficiency of cars get improved, that there's less energy poverty and the insulation of buildings are improved, that agriculture is done in a more sustainable way, etc. So there are a lot of opportunities associated with this overall climate framework. But I think these opportunities are sort of under threat by certain, what we call loopholes. This is flexibilities that in the end are harmful for our climate objective because they sort of undermine our climate target. And one of them was already mentioned by Nils. It's this one-off ETS flexibility. So this is a sort of, you allow member states, certain member states, mostly richer member states, to use the surplus of emission allowances in the ETS to meet with their non-ETS target. The problem what we see with this is that there is a large surplus in the ETS, so taking a little bit of surplus out of the EU's carbon market is not going to lead to more emission reductions in these ETS sectors, while it will undermine the efforts in the non-ETS sectors. So in total, this will lead to higher emissions in the EU, we fear. We think, therefore, that there should be a firewall between the two different instruments. There's a lot of problems associated with the ETS, and these need to be addressed very urgently. but we shouldn't be trying to fix the ETS through another policy instrument like the effort sharing decision. And we see that by using these ETS permits, we could undermine our 30% target by 2%. Another sort of flexibility or loophole, which was already highlighted before, is the use of forestry offsets. So it's still an open question how forestry will be dealt with in the 2030 climate framework. And one of the options that some member states have put forward is to sort of compensate agriculture emissions by offsets from the forest sectors. And we see this also as problematic because we think that, well, it's very, very urgently needed to achieve negative emissions in the forest sectors to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. This should be done in addition to the efforts and the emission reductions of other sectors and not sort of replacing those. Also, the forestry sector is very different from other sectors. For example, the removals might not be permanent. When you emit fossil fuels, the emissions of fossil fuels are permanent. When you release them in the atmosphere, they're there. However, the CO2 that is absorbed by a tree can be released again when you burn it. So this is an issue that needs to be taken into account when allowing for these offsets. And other issues are around the fact that forestry emissions or removals we have seen large annual fluctuations, a lot of recalculations, and there are accounting rules that simply hide emissions. So we think these forestry offsets, together with the ETS surplus, are two flexibilities or loopholes that might be very problematic for the overall ambition level of this instrument. I guess the final one is that there is a threat of carryover of the surplus that is being built in the system right now. So the current ESD, the targets have been set very weak. There has been economic recession. So a lot of member states don't have any problems meeting their targets. In fact, they will have a surplus of AAAs being built up. The European Environment Agency estimates that this will be up to 1.7 billion surplus tons of CO2 equivalents by 2020. And there are some member states that say that we want to use this surplus also after 2020. This is currently not allowed, and we don't think it will come back to the table, but it's something to watch out for, because this could really damage all of the climate potential of the effort sharing decision in the future.
Well, thank you, Femke. I think you made your perspective on this very clear. But I'd like to, and there are many points that I would like to pick up on from that intervention. But maybe I can bring that to you, Nils. So, that sense of flexibility being sort of something that is an issue, or past achievements in terms of emissions reductions being a problem. Could you elaborate on why that you think that is the case? Because on the one hand, the mechanism is meant to help achieve a certain outcome, and these mechanisms supposedly are meant to facilitate member states' achievement of those targets. So, and as you pointed out earlier, the mechanisms that exist in the system don't seem to be considered to be sufficient, because EU heads of state and government have asked for enhancements. So can you give us your take on this? Where's this coming from, that on the one hand Femke is pointing out that there is potentially quite a risk from her perspective, but there is a demand at the political level to make it easier?
Thank you, Matthias. Well, there is this political demand, that's correct. But at the same time, there is no experience with the current flexibilities. So that's really important to understand. I mean, we have, the current ESD has a number of flexibilities, as I mentioned before. It's a transfer between member states, as member states can borrow and borrow emissions from the previous year. So there's already a number of flexibilities. And these flexibilities have not been tested. And so we have no experience with these experiences so far. I mean, it's actually in a way similar what we see at the renewables, where the renewable directive has also a number of flexibilities, and they are hardly used. So it's a bit odd. And on the one hand, we have little experience or no experience with flexibilities. On the other hand, we have the demand of enhanced flexibility. So my take on this is, on the one hand, we have a higher target for the next decade. So the ESD target will increase from 10% to 30%. At the same time, we should not forget there will be, or there's very likely to be, a significant surplus in the system. So it might be actually easier to achieve the 30%. If you only look at the numbers, you could be shocked. I mean, you could say, well, 10% and now you have 30%. So that's a dramatic increase. But in fact, you have to look at the numbers and the surplus. So that the increase might not be as significant as it looks. So my take on why the European Council has demanded higher flexibility is, I think it's partly mentioned by Femke. There is a concern that it will be difficult to achieve the national targets. And to achieve these national targets, member states are quite interested in having more flexibility, so different means of achieving their target. But as I said before, it's an untested question, and we don't know what actually has happened so far, because I mean the compliance cycle for ESD has only started in 2013, and data is only available now for the first years. So it is something that is not tested yet, and it's largely a political question, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I still have 3 points left from that part of the conversation, and I'll take one that focuses more at the efforts that can be done at the national level, and then one referring back to policies at the EU level. At the national level first, you've both referred to there being possibilities that member states can use, but also a sense of concern or anticipation of the need to be achieving these additional emissions reductions, or an apprehension, if you will. So one of the ways that I understand that the flexibility discussion is also motivated by is by giving member states the opportunity to engage the private sector in a stronger fashion than is currently the case. What, from your perspective, Femke, maybe I can start with at your end, what options do member states have to do that, and do you think that using new flexibilities like the project mechanism that Nils referred to, is that a good way forward? And I know that obviously sort of the background of Carbon Market Watch is very much from also similar types of mechanisms at the international level, and people who know you and the organization will know that you have a very critical perspective on their workings. So, with that as context, what is your perspective on engaging private sector options for member states?
Well, I think it is indeed very important, because these ESD targets are set at the national level. So the national governments are responsible for meeting this target. But obviously, in order for them to meet this target, they need also the involvement of the private sector. But this is only, I think, important for certain sectors more than for others. If you look at the transport sector, for example, there is a big role also for the government to be involved. They are responsible for the infrastructure. They're often responsible for the public transport systems, etc. So there is, in these sectors, and I think also for agriculture and waste, a big role for the government, which is why the ESD has the obligation on the member state level rather than the private level. However, for example, if you look at energy efficiency measures and increasing sort of the efficiency of our building stock, I think there it can be quite useful to also engage the private sector more. I think, first of all, this is because often the private sector is willing to take on some risk that a government might not be willing to take on, but also because there's upfront capital needed to do this, and there are some lower income member states where it's quite difficult to get this upfront capital. Now, one of the questions is how to then best achieve these emission reductions, and there are several options how this can be done. It is already possible, as Nils was saying before, that member states trade AAAs among each other, and obviously this can sort of also then ensure that a lower income member state, where there is still some potential for emission reductions, implements additional efforts in the building sector to achieve this. But although we don't have any experience, these bilateral exchanges are faced with certain issues around what is the right carbon price. Member states don't really know how much they should pay for these AAAs and how this trading, there's no common methodology how this trading needs to be done. So this is where I think the idea of a project-based mechanism came from, where you sort of have a project, for example, in a country like the Czech Republic that increases the efficiency of a building stock, and the Czech Republic, the government of the Czech Republic, then sells the reductions from this project to another member state, say to Denmark, for example. There are some issues around this new flexibility. I think personally it could be useful, but we need to be very careful that it's designed right and that it doesn't lead to sort of fake reductions. In the end, this needs to apply only to deep renovation, to projects that really make a difference to the consumers and citizens in, for example, the Czech Republic in this case. Then there is another idea, which was also mentioned by Nils, of auctioning AAAs. And I think maybe this is something also which could be quite useful. At the moment, as said before, member states don't really know what is the price they should use for emission reductions in the non-ETS sectors. And by auctioning them, you sort of put a price on this pollution. And you also generate revenues. And these revenues, I think, potentially could be earmarked for additional reductions in lower income member states in the building stock, using the expertise maybe of other member states' policies to do this. So I think there are several different flexibilities and all have downsides and advantages. But I think thinking creatively how to design flexibilities in order that they sort of increase our climate ambition and lead to more reductions, especially in lower income member states, I think is going to be very important.
Thank you very much for that, Femke. I'd like to give Nils the chance to also speak to that topic, but with a dedicated question. When I listen to Femke on this, one of the things that I wonder about is, in the new system where all member states will actually have to make, will have at least a 0% stabilization target. Don't they essentially all require, their own reductions, if you will? What's the incentive for selling to other member states? If you could elaborate on that, Nils, from your perspective, whether you think that actually is a viable mechanism that member states are likely to use.
Well, I mean, one of the basic ideas of the project mechanism is the assumption that in some, let's say, member state A, reductions are cheaper than in member state B. So, I mean, the basic assumption is that there's a difference in abatement costs between member states. So, and if a member state is interested in or is required to reduce its emission, it could use these project mechanisms and pay a project developer for implementing a specific project in a member state where abatement costs are lower, and thereby meeting or helping to meet its target through a mechanism that is less costly. So that's the theoretical approach. I mean, the other one is, of course, that we would like to see more private involvement through these projects, because we believe that, or there's the basic assumption that private companies are more creative, more innovative than governments in finding innovative, cheap solutions for reducing emissions. So that's the basic assumption. I think it makes sense in principle. It makes sense, but we should not forget there are already a number of other schemes that allow for the involvement of private companies. Particularly, I mean, different funding schemes. I mean, the EU or member states have different funding schemes to help private investors to implement their projects. And you should not forget that the project mechanism is not as such cost-free. I mean, member states have to probably find some kind of co-funding for these projects. So it's not like that we have the mechanism and member states would not have to pay any monies. It's not that the case. The project mechanism is more about facilitating project. It helps to trigger a project, but it's not as such a replacement for other funding schemes, and that is really important to understand. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you very much, Nils. And sort of with that, I think I'd like to actually sort of move away from the national level to the European dimension, because, you know, as you've outlined in your explanation of how the system works, Femke, there are certain types of sectors that are covered by the effort sharing system, and there are several EU-level common policies and measures that already exist and try to address emissions from those sectors. Nevertheless, there seems to be, you know, as you outlined yourself, the onus for target achievement is on member states here, and apparently, and that is also evidenced by the discussion on project mechanisms at the national level, they seem to be in need of additional policies. So what is your sense of this? Shouldn't there be additional policies and measures decided at the EU level that would help member states achieve the targets at the national level, rather than member states basically being left to their own devices and having to figure out each one by themselves how do they get to their targets? And maybe actually, Nils, if you feel like it, could you start with that question?
Sure. I mean that's one fundamental. It's fundamental to the ESD to understand the ESD is about target setting. So it's an architecture. It sits above a number of other EU measures, namely the EED, I mean the Energy Efficiency Directive, or directive on the performance of buildings. There's a number of directives or rules on EU level on transport. So, but the ESD does what it does is it's like the roof or the umbrella, and but it requires for implementation these additional EU measures, and I think that makes sense. It does make sense that there is this these pillars, if you like, or these assisting EU rules, and that require action at national level. And action at national level is, of course, adopting or transposing EU requirements, but it's also engaging in action. Just make it happen, renovating buildings, reducing transport emissions, etc. So I think in the basic idea that we have EU rules that require implementation, for example, Energy Efficiency Directive, and then a great number of different policies and measures and laws at national level. That is in principle a sensible approach. The question is, of course, in the details. I mean, is the level of ambition sufficient? Are there inefficiency in the system? I mean, these are the questions that we have to deal with all the time. I mean, that's natural, and all in all, there are, of course, inefficiencies in the system, but the basic approach makes sense.
Mm. Femke, do you have, what's your take on this? Do you see areas in which you would actually see that member states would be helped specifically by additional policies at the EU level?
Yes, I think that is one of the things that we see as an opportunity of the effort sharing decision, is that it sort of is a trigger for member states asking the EU to come forward with policies that help them meet their targets. And this, I think, specifically applies to sort of source policies. For example, the CO2 standard for cars and trucks and vans. Having EU policy for that is very beneficial. I mean, we have an internal market in the EU, so these sort of policies need to be done at the EU level. And at the same time, they reduce transport emissions in all the different member states. We have another example, which is the Eco-Design Directive, which sort of sets efficiency requirements on a lot of products, including, for example, in the future, boilers. So these source policies, I think, are really needed from a member state perspective, but also from an NGO perspective, to very cost-effectively reduce our emissions in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That was sort of the second of the 3 points that I mentioned earlier, and the third one that I'd like to come back to is, Femke, you were already explaining the potential issues with including the important source of emissions that is represented by land use and land use change and forestry, an element that that you were saying would now be included in the system in some form. Can you tell us, you were very critical of linking certainly forestry offsets to the ESD. Can you give us really a sort of super short version of what your suggestion is for how to deal with the emissions from those types of sources?
Yes, I try to be very short on this. It's a very complicated topic, actually. I mean, if you think the effort-sharing decision is complicated, LULUCF, as it's called, land use, and forestry, is even more difficult. And I guess that's one of the problems also with this sector, that it's very difficult to monitor and report and account for these emissions and removals. And there's still a lot of questions on how to do this in a way that you properly account for the climate impact of forest and land use. So what we think is the best way forward is to have a separate pillar for the land use sector. And you can, I think it's very, very important to make sure that the carbon sink, so the CO2 that is absorbed by trees and by land, that this is increased in the future. And I think there needs to be measures and financing at the EU and national levels that leads to better forest management, etc. And this is very crucial, especially now with the Paris Agreement, where we have sort of an obligation to move towards net zero emissions. We have a new goal of 1.5 degrees, and we can only achieve this if we focus both on emission reductions of fuels, for example, and on top of that, increase the carbon sink of our forest and land use. So we want to have forestry in a separate pillar, sort of in a way on top of our 40% target. So these efforts need to be in addition to the efforts of all the other sectors, and this can then be sort of a way of the EU of increasing its 2030 climate target.
Thank you very much. This is indeed a specialized topic. Nils, just to check, would you like to add?
No, I mean, I think it's really essential. I know there's actually nothing to add. I think just to highlight, I mean, it needs to be a third pillar because of all the difficulties that Femke lined out. And in addition, I would like to say that LULUCF, of course, has a lot of implication for biodiversity policies. And that we should not engage in a system that harms actually biodiversity goals.
Mm. Thank you very much to both of you for indulging me in an additional section on LULUCF. And now let's turn for sort of a final segment to the political landscape. So we expect that the European Commission is going to publish a proposal for a new effort-sharing instrument before the summer, if I'm not mistaken. And so, that'll be at the heart of a set of legislative proposals that are assumed to be negotiated together as a package, probably over at least a year and a half after publication. Can you let me know, on the basis of the issues that we discussed, how do you see the political landscape? Where are there, champions for specific issues? I assume, Femke, for the political work that Carbon Market Watch is doing in these areas, you monitor this closely. Could you kindly share sort of your insights without, giving away your trade secrets?
Yes, I will try to do that. I think indeed, as you said, we expect a legislative proposal for the 2030 effort-sharing decision before summer from the Commission. So what's happening at the moment is that the Commission is talking to member state experts and the countries and discuss the different options of how the efforts are shared between the different member states. And I think this, like I said before, goes hand in hand with the discussion on flexibilities or loopholes, because as you might realize, there are some member states that have, for example, Ireland, that has a very large agriculture sector. And I think it's fair to say that it is quite difficult to, in a short term, significantly reduce emissions from agriculture. So Ireland is looking for a solution for the agriculture problem. You have countries like Poland that are a bit more skeptical towards climate change and are still very much reliant on coal, and therefore are also hesitant to take on a climate target that they should get based on GDP per capita. So I think there's a lot of work ongoing on how to please every member state, and I think therefore it's very important to make sure that the benefits of the system of the 2030 ESD are not forgotten. And that's where also we come in, that we try to sort of highlight that there are also smart flexibilities that you could introduce that don't undermine the overall ambition level. So for example, when you talk about LULUCF and land use, there are certain member states, including, I guess, the one I mentioned before, that want to
Ireland,
put these together. Ireland, Poland, that want to use those forestry offsets to undermine their climate targets. But I think there can also be smarter solutions around this. For example, if you look at Poland, I think there is potential of using funding streams under the ETS. You're saying the negotiations among the ETS and the effort sharing decision are going to go hand in hand, and there are some funds under the ETS that are specifically designed to also help countries like Poland decarbonize their economy, including in non-ETS sectors. So I think there is potential to I wouldn't say trade the different elements, but at least to make sure that everyone concerns are addressed, but still the ambition level is maintained. But I mean, all these things are still very much open questions, and one of the additional elements that we have been looking at recently is how the carbon budgets are set. And it's very important for a carbon budget is where do you start in 2020. And as highlighted, I think, before by Nils as well, is that we will overachieve our 2020 target of 10%. So if you start at our 2020 target and then you go down to 30% in 2030, in total, you emit more greenhouse gas emissions than if you would start at the actual emissions in 2020. So this is also an area of debate between the Commission and Member States and other stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Femke. So it seems that it'll be a little bit of every member state for themselves, because they very much have to take their national circumstances into consideration. I'd like to pose a final question to you, Nils, on a term that has hardly been mentioned, I think, as part of our conversation over the last 40 minutes, which is the word Paris. And this debate, the negotiations on this package of policies over the next 2 years will take place in the context of actually us having, knock on wood, an international new global deal on climate change with the Paris Agreement. Give us your highlights, 2 or 3 points. To what extent do you see that this changes the debate on effort sharing in the EU?
Yeah, I mean, Paris, I think that was actually what I was just about to mention. The Paris Agreement is an international legally binding agreement that requires all ratifying countries to aim to meet the 2-degree target. So what does it mean for the EU if we try to achieve a 2-degree world? Well, I mean, of course, there's a lot of science behind this, but there's also an agreement among member states that the EU must reduce its emission to meet 2 degrees by 80 to 95% in 2050. So that is substantial amount, 80 to 95%. If you look at 80%, that means you have to reduce emissions annually at 3.3% after 2030. And if you want to achieve 95%, it means 4.6% every year. 4.6% is what we have seen once in the last 20 years, 25 years, and that was in 2009. After the economic crisis. So, I mean, just to say this, I mean, it is a huge undertaking, I mean, to achieve this type of reductions, no doubt about it. But that is what requires us if we want to meet, if we want to stay below the 2-degree target, and that is what Paris requires us to do. And the effort sharing decision in the EU will play a major role in this. I mean, as we have outlined at the beginning, the effort sharing decision covers 60% of the EU emissions. So it's essential element of the EU efforts to reduce its emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. I don't want to go into the legal details or the science behind all this. I mean, of course, there's discussion whether 2 degrees means 80%, 95%, or means negative emissions. All this that is something we should not discuss here at this moment. But I mean, what is clear is that it requires a huge effort, and the effort sharing needs to play a major role in this respect. And what it means in detail, it's up to further discussion, but it probably means that we have to go for a long-term target in the effort-sharing decision, because, I mean, as we know, reduction that we achieve now are generally the cheaper ones than those that we achieve later. So to put us really on a trajectory for decarbonizing our economies, or to meet 95%, 80%, we will have to have a strong signal to investors, not only to investors but to societies, that we have a legally binding target also in the effort sharing decision or elsewhere that is clearly in line with the Paris Agreement, i.e. 2 degrees.
Thank you very much, Nils. So you're saying the target on the basis of which the discussions are currently taking place may not be sufficient. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so this may be sort of taking us a little bit further away from our topic, but maybe as a very last point, because as we are recording this, the European Commission has just a week ago released their communication on Paris. So Femke, what is your sense? Is there scope to having that conversation now about changing the target, the 40% that this is all geared towards, or does that have to take place later?
Well, I think if there ever was a time to talk about increasing our climate ambition, it's now, just coming out of Paris, where we have seen it's almost a universal participation in this new climate agreement. It's really historic, and as highlighted by Nils, as NGOs and I think also a lot of people in the scientific community, they think that what the EU has put on table is not enough in order to reach the overall objective of the Paris Agreement. So I think at the moment there should be a discussion about increasing ambition, and then is the question how to do this best. And I think we already have the proposal for the EU ETS of the 2020 on the table. The ESD proposal is going to come up before summer. So this discussion about increasing ambition can take place between the European Parliament, the democratically elected parliamentarians, and the Council of Ministers and EU leaders. So when negotiating the details of these different proposals, there should also be a discussion about, is the current ambition in these proposals enough? And if not, how can they be increased? And if they cannot be increased overall for the EU, can at least certain member states go beyond their own targets? And are there other ways of reviewing and ratcheting up ambition over time? And I think these things indeed need to be kept in mind in the proposals that are out or that are coming out very shortly.
Thank you very much. So, this gives us, I think, a flavor of the fact that not only is this sort of a highly technical and politicized discussion at the European level, but it actually has very strong connections and interlinkages with the international process. And it'll be one to watch for 2016 and 2017, that's for sure. Thank you both. Thanks to both of you very much for making the time and for sharing your expertise and your perspectives. We really appreciate that a lot. And thanks to everybody who is watching live and has been watching this recording on YouTube. And check out a couple of our other POLIMP webinar topics online. Bye-bye, everybody.